Well, we're here today with Dr. David Rudder, Associate Dean of School of Professional and Continuing Studies at Springfield College. I'm certain he's going to give you an insight-filled call.
It was great. So high energy, had me engaged the entire time.
I think what's great about Kevin's message is that, no matter how naturally talented you are, or no matter how great you can be, you can always keep striving for that next level. And even, if you become complacent, you might not even realize you've done it. But Kevin really helps you realize, that there's so much more that you can do. If you take a step back, really reevaluate what you're doing and what you're not doing, you can take it to the next level.
I loved his message about God's gift to you and your gift back. And he's just so down to earth and just a helpful, wonderful man.
Really, I think you can put him in front of anybody and you're going to be inspired, you're going to be motivated, you're going to want to go out there and you're going to want to start, reaching for that next level today.
Hey, thanks so much for joining in to the Leadership is Personal podcast, bringing you real-world solutions to real-world challenges in anywhere from 3 to 10-minute increments. Leadership is personal. Here's the better results.
David?
Yes, I am good, Kevin. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we dig in, we're talking about the hashtag Me Too movement. I won't dig in a whole lot to say, to sort of tee up the discussion, but suffice it to say that the hashtag Me Too movement really didn't get traction until 2017, though we know that Tarana Burke started this way back in 2006. And so tell me, what are your initial thoughts about the hashtag Me Too movement?
I think as somebody who has studied oppression, I think clearly this is something long overdue and brings to highlight really women within the workplace who have historically been denied a voice. And in the history of working in a patriarchal system that really demotes or diminishes their worth is nothing new to us. I just think we have a movement that really much has put women to have a platform and have a voice. And I think with more women rising up in very prominent positions of leadership within our institutions of higher learning, within our corporate structures, I think it's now time that hence this movement has gotten some momentum. I think if women have not moved up into leadership roles, I don't necessarily know if the Me Too movement would be so big. But I think the fact that it is, they now have a voice and they have a platform, which is long overdue.
Interesting. You said they have a platform, they have a voice. I mentioned initially that this started in about 2006.
Yes.
But it really didn't get any traction until that fateful day that Alyssa Milano sent that tweet out.
Correct.
And asked people to sort of lean in using, the hashtag Me Too. And then that was quickly followed by Gwyneth Paltrow and Ashley Judd, Uma Thurman. So it begged me to question, does it need a celebrity or does it need a certain type of celebrity to get that sort of...
Well, that's a deeper discussion. We can talk about when we talk about oppression of women, there's different realities of women of color as compared to majority women, right? So to the extent when we talk about the issue of, and I'm clearly not an expert on this arena, probably somebody in gender studies would be better than me, but however, we know that the lived circumstances and realities of women of color have always played out differently as compared to their white contemporaries. So to the extent that a movement where women of color may have been on the forefront of something and it may not have gotten the level of movement, let's just say but when a white woman's able to present a similar issue, the narrative is received differently. Right. So that's historically what we have known to be the case. So I don't think that's anything new, but I do think it's something to put into the ether about how we examine the Me Too movement and even with women themselves as a subgroup. And when you look at women of color as compared to majority women, how their messages and how their stories are received. And they may not be received equally in the same level of validity and the same level of need to respond to. And I think those are internal conversations within the movement that I'm sure women and other individuals are having, but I'm not surprised by that. Does that make sense, what I've just said? I know I've said a lot, but I want to... Absolutely.
Okay. And as you know, I'm not going to interject and I'm not going to, I really want to hear your voice. I want to hear what you have to say about it. And I think the callers want to hear, kind of what your perspective. And especially given that you work with graduate students and adult graduate students primarily, how then does this sort of movement impact your ability to prepare women for what they're going to have to deal with in the workplace?
Well,
how does it impact academia?
Well, I think, for me, the vast majority of my students are working adults, so they're already in the workforce. So I think the question that we're talking about is how do we create, from an educational perspective, what are some of the inherent challenges that women face based on a patriarchal system by which they're asked to operate from? Very simple things, of how do we think about the role of women within workspaces? Are they viewed as equal as men? Are they given similar latitudes? Do men have a freedom to orchestrate and act a certain way because it's been allowed and permissible for years? I mean, this is really what we have to ask ourselves. Are we really changing the landscape of organizational structures to reflect a much more diverse workforce that does not just include men? And if so, how are women's voices and how we look to present a workplace that is not hostile to women, that understands the realities of women? How are we creating those type of spaces? Are we even having those conversations that those spaces are important? And I would say there's some industries that are on top of the curve who are doing it that are much more progressive as compared to others. And I think we need to look at those best practices where those are taking place. And so I think what we talk about is, how do we allow not just students, but how do we have men who also need to be educated on their inherent privilege? Like you and I have privilege by the fact that we are men, right? In that, how are we even aware about what our privilege and what our power has? And we may not be aware of it, but we need to be educated on that. And we may not look to oppress individuals or oppress women by it, but we need to understand inherently we have a privilege as being men in a patriarchal society. Even though we're men of color, there's still something to be said about what that means. Does that make sense?
By the very nature of our gender, we have privilege. Yeah, it does. The interesting thing is that some would argue that the hashtag Me Too movement has caused a course correction. But some would argue maybe an over course correction where men are considered guilty until proven innocent.
Well, and we can absolutely say that that's correct. We cannot let the due process system be eroded. You cannot just make an accusation where somebody doesn't have the opportunity to respond or have the right to due process. That can't be allowed. So just because somebody makes an accusation, just because a woman makes an accusation, we do not need to take it on face value that is absolutely accurate, right? So anybody needs to be entitled to a due process, and we can't lose that. I think we're in a culture of cancel culture. People are talking about, we're going to cancel him and we're just going to dismiss him because we've heard this one thing and we've heard this one accusation made against him. And we can say, for instance, here's an interesting thing. We have the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, I believe, there were several allegations made against him. He still got nominated to the Supreme Court and has a job for the rest of his life.
That's true.
Right now, you have the gentleman who's the lieutenant governor, I believe, in Virginia, where two women have come forward and accused him of sexual harassment. And I think to the extent that sexual assault, and people are asking that he be removed from office. So in one breath, we didn't have a full investigation on the Brett Kavanaugh to go into the Supreme Court. But however, we've had a judgment of this gentleman who's the lieutenant governor say he needs to be removed from office, which he's simply saying, let the FBI go in, let's do a full investigation, and everybody should be entitled to that right. So I think what we've done as a society, we've McDonaldized, we want these quick responses to very much a complicated issue. There's no complication to being equal. There's no complication that, you should not feel assaulted or feel threatened. There's no dispute there. But what becomes complicated is, are we talking about something that is morally wrong as compared to something that is illegal? So, right, one can say something and it might offend somebody, so it might be morally wrong. But then did I do something that was outside the lines of the law by committing a sexual assault act? Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes all the sense in the world.
So I think those level of differentiation needs to be broken down, right? Those sense of double standards that we have, that rush to judgment, we need to be a little bit more nuanced in that. And I think we need to have the full extent of investigations taking place. And what we have to say is that women's voices have been suppressed. That cannot be denied. That has been historical, and that is still relevant. With that being said, once an accusation comes up, it now takes to light is that we need to travel a path of due process for anybody who would be accused of something. As a result, so let us do our due process as it relates to that, do the appropriate investigations, and then come down to see what do the facts reveal. And if the facts reveal that somebody committed a crime, then appropriately do all the necessary things to address that which has been deemed illegal in action. If one is a moral issue, then how do we educate people about how we need to engage one another, and I think so there's an educational process as a society that we need to go through. And there's a thing about gender, toxic masculinity that's out there that promotes men who conduct themselves in such a way when, in a sense, they don't necessarily see women or value them in a way of them being equal. So it inherently breeds a system or mentality that they themselves are not even aware of, that unconscious bias that they even have. So we need to educate people on that at the same time, not giving people a pass, but realizing it's a more nuanced conversation. It's just not that black and white. Sexual assault, black and white. If somebody says no, no means no, right? There's no real to differentiate that. That is wrong. But I think the nuances of what gets clouded is that gray stuff that takes place within the Me Too movement of how we get around having these types of conversations.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So what you've said there has caused me to think of a few things. Let me take on the first one, which was Kavanaugh versus the lieutenant governor of Virginia. There's a little bit of a difference between those two. Mm-hmm. And I think you know what I'm getting at. And while this is not a discussion about race per se, it does come into play.
Sure.
Do you think that it had a place or a sort of cause and effect relationship in this situation as you compare the two? Because both are accusations.
Sure. I think, and I think for some of us in America, it absolutely does. Right? When we feel justice, we're supposed to have blind justice, right? I believe that is that the term? Justice should be blind and equal to all, and we really know that it has not been. We know that for a fact. We know that for a fact when we look at our penal system, when we look at just the rate of, let's say, suspensions in schools when it comes to black and brown boys as compared to others. They are just treated harshly. It's not a big argument or big gap to suggest when we look at these two gentlemen that we just referenced to suggest that one is going to be treated a little bit different. It's not a far stretch to say. So I think that's reasonable. And I think what we do give in this, in light of this, and this is moving away from the topic, that some of us get the benefit of the doubt in America, right? We get the benefit of the doubt based on how we look. And unfortunately, that plays itself out in many arenas. So I think it's no different from the examples we just referenced. But then that's why I always go back. We need to follow the due process. Make sure that we do our due diligence, no matter who it is, that if somebody has committed an illegal act, that they absolutely must face the consequences of their actions.
Wow. I couldn't agree with you more. This is really a touchy subject, and it's one that we need to deal with, in our organizations. The other thing that it caused me to question, as you referenced earlier in the conversation, that, more women are moving into these sort of more senior positions. And so, one might hypothesize that the tables may turn, and we may see, we may begin to see more and more that the situation, the shoe's on the other foot, where the woman is the aggressor, if you will.
I mean, sure, but that's an argument. That's an argument we could. We can take such an argument and go to the extreme. And I think, of course, and there's no real discussion to really have an extreme ends, right? So I think like anything, do our human resource policies reflect a workplace that allows for both men and women to feel safe and protected? That is what our policies need to do in our human resource, in our human resource department. Are human resource departments made with robust, trained individuals that are are ensuring that these type of work environments take place and that we're not just doing these, you got to do a sexual harassment training that time of year, just let me do it, let me complete it. But are we really doing stuff that really is helping to change and educate a culture? And for me, I think if you have the right people at the table for the discussions, because historically, we haven't had the right people at the discussion. So why
would we now?
I would make the argument the numbers don't necessarily have we seen a shift in growth, but when you look at the aggregate number, I'm not sure how much advancement we truly have had in the pure aggregate, but we can't deny that there's been some growth. So when we talk about is there's this whole plethora of women leadership, and now we have to be concerned as men and all I don't necessarily know if I buy into that so much.
Well, I'll tell you what, you said, our human resources area. Or department,
Yeah.
Right? And the first word of that is human. And as humans, we know that we have these unconscious bias. And so that begs the question, at least in my mind, a couple of questions. One, as a country, as a work, as organizations, are we, able to see, women of color as innocent? One. The second question, are we able to see men as innocent? Two questions. What do you think?
I don't know what those questions mean. As
so
innocent.
If we have people saying that I was assaulted, if you have a woman of color saying I was assaulted, can we as a body, can we as a country see them as innocent? As I think about the juror that was interviewed and we saw on the Surviving R. Kelly documentary, they interviewed one of the jurors and he said, well, I didn't like her. I didn't like what she had on.
So look at that response right there. I didn't watch that documentary, but let's just take what you said. You had a man who said, I did not like what she was wearing, not what she was saying, not the point she was making. He made an opinion to judge somebody based on what he or she is wearing. And women have historically had to deal with that. Oh, well, look at what she was wearing. Did that justify that a man could put his hands on her, that he could attempt to rape her because she looked like she was loose? This whole thing about appearance and that thing about appearance and being able to pass judgment on somebody is no doubt a position of privilege, and it's a position of power. So when we talk about that, we're really talking about, do we really see women as equals? Because it's really about a position of power. So the example you gave is like, I didn't like this person based on what they were wearing. Like, when have you ever heard somebody say a man is being judged like, oh, well, I didn't like him because of what he was wearing? I think women have to deal with this type of reality that is inherently, we accept that to be normal, but it's a power dynamic that exists in that.
And so how do we fix that
by acknowledging it? By acknowledging it, by saying to that gentleman who you just referenced as a juror, like, why does she whatsoever about what she is wearing has anything to do with whether she's a credible witness? That is where we start the conversation. And why do we say that? And why would a man say that it's even appropriate to be able to say, well, that's even a point of reference? Like, why am I even thinking about what she is wearing rather than what she is saying? What does that say about me? What is that inherently processing, right? So a lot of it is about educating our men about this. It's not, women have to be educated too, but there's an inherent bias and assumptions that men are allowed to conduct, and historically we live in a patriarchal society. So we are dealing with the what happens in our schools, what happens in our corporations, what happens within our organizations are just a microcosm of society. The same individuals that are out there in the world are out there within our offices. So why would we think there's not a parallel reality that exists there? So it's really a question about changing the culture of education.
And so how then, as you think about the seat that you sit in, right? Because you're working with the people that are in our HR departments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you guys address that at all?
Well, I think we do. Well, we do within our curriculum. I will say that we talk about the issues of social oppression and being able to understand it, its history, be able to assess about how it plays out in policies today, and inherently what we don't think about, that is still areas where people feel oppressed, whether it be by gender, whether it be by race, economics, sexual identity. Like, how does it play itself out? So I think we do a decent job of saying that we need to orient our students and understand the thinking of oppression comes in many forms. And then how do we either contribute to it, or how do we look to break the cycles of stopping oppression? I think we do a decent job within our curriculum to talk about that, because that's important to us in from a value standpoint. So I think we do that. And so I can say from a standpoint of being an educator, it's important that our curriculum, our classes reflect the society that we would like it to be. Right? How are we educating people to be agents of social change? So the conversations that we have here, everybody's not going to march. Everybody ain't going to march on Main Street, right? That's not everybody. Right. Some people might just write a check. But what we can do with everybody is educate everybody about principles of oppression, understanding how their inherent beliefs and growths and how they operate within a structure that supports either them being oppressors or them being oppressed themselves. And then how do we reconcile that? Right? You and I have daughters, we can say that. And in that, we've had to retrain ourselves and realize ooh, I didn't understand how that may come across, right? We've all been in that conversation with our wife, and daughters are like, oh, I didn't know it would be received that way. Thank you. Right? So it's about saying, am I open to be receiving a different type of message? Am I open to want to do that? Am I open to saying that I want a more just society? I want to believe I have a place where my daughter will be able to be viewed and judged on the merits and the character of who she is as a person without any relevance of her gender.
Or what she's wearing.
Oh, absolutely. Well said.
Hey, that led me to think of a question, though, David. As much as you and other universities and colleges across the country, I would imagine, teach about social oppression, I wonder, is there an opportunity, or is there a dearth in education about power? Because sexual assault is really an assault about power.
Absolutely.
And so, do we teach about power?
Well, you raise a good question, right? So that's now like saying you have to be critical of the system by which you live in, and be able to do we have classes by which people absolutely explore that? Oh, I would say across any college or university that is the case. The question is, how do we therefore even examine the roles of power within our current campus climates, right? How do we talk about that? How do we talk about those? Here's a perfect example. I believe there was at oh my gosh, what was the university when the young lady was waiting for her class? She was an adjunct faculty member, and public safety was called on. Somebody called public safety on this woman as she was waiting in the classroom for her class to come. She was there a little bit early. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that one.
But here's the subtlety, right? Here's another one. This took place at Smith College last year, where the young lady was sitting eating, and public safety was called on her because she did not look like a Smith College student. Right? The inherent belief, then she happened to be a young lady of color, was that she did not look like a Smith College student, and public safety was called on her. Right, that is in a sense an abuse of power, that you can think you can pass a judgment and look on somebody and think that they don't belong on this particular college campus.
We've seen that play out across the country.
So to my point, getting back to my point is that it is just not about the classroom; it's about the actual practice of policies and structures within our institutions. So though we can educate about it, we have to therefore then educate people and then go back and reevaluate our current systems of structures and how they operate.
Well, that sounds like, wow, that sounds like culture, right? I mean, the mere notion that you are in a privileged culture, I guess I would say, the mere notion that you are in a culture and you can feel comfortable calling the police or calling, as you call it, public safety, because someone doesn't look like they belong in your culture.
Yes.
Are there dynamics afoot that are driving some of that behavior? Oh. I ask in a very transparent veil. I really wonder, quite frankly, if I'm going to be totally transparent, I wonder if the rhetoric of today is driving some of this.
No question about it. It's the rhetoric, and it's the brazen sense of, what's the word I want to say? because you wouldn't say certain things, because I think there's a sense of there's no fear. There's no fear that there's any recourse that will be done to me as a result of these actions. I think there's a sense of freedom that people have that has been revealed. I think this is going on before our current administration, but I think he just echoes sentiments that it gives that allows people to feel a sense of being emboldened. Right,
yes.
And I think
gives license to lack.
Yes, right, and we've come to a point where, in a sense, we believe and suggest that everybody has a right to share their opinion, and that may be true. But
here's a question: so if you, as we're talking about this hashtag Me Too movement,
yes,
and we've just elected our 45th president, who during election time,
correct,
we have in his voice some rather vulgar commentary around, we'll say, grabbing women.
Yes, he has absolutely acknowledged that he was a sexual assaulter.
But yet and still, we just elected him as the 45th president, and we elected him, I think, as the 45th president against a woman. And so you have, in the very same time period, you have people who say a woman can't be president. So there's a part of me that says, if I have to choose, the country has spoken, if I have to choose between a sexual assaulter or a woman, I'm going to go with the sexual assaulter.
And so now that speaks to how deep and ingrained a patriarchal society is around the issue of oppression of women, right? Now, we can't oversimplify to simply say as a man versus a woman. There are other nuances about who the candidates were, right? We can't dismiss that. But what you are simply saying is no reason why you cannot suggest and argue where you have a percentage of women who voted, the vast majority, I think majority of the statistics show the majority of women who are white voted for this, voted for our current president. It was something. So you have to say, right. So you have to say, in looking at this, and this is why the nuances, and it's a more complicated thing, like what is the rationale that surrounds about that? And we cannot dismiss that, the fact that we cannot believe that a patriarchal system doesn't have something to play into that, right? We can't just dismiss that as a variable. How great a variable that is, that's subjective, I think. But you cannot dismiss that is a variable. How ingrained it is into our culture, where in the sense that we're not even remotely grossed out by somebody who can openly say what he said, feel what he feels about women, and then be able to receive that percentage of the vote. That I think that says something.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I was right.
Yeah, there are certain comments that that you and guests have made, on the show that just you're so flabbergasted that you really don't have anything to say about it.
No,
right? I mean,
you're right, Kevin. I want to tell you what one of my favorite professors has said to me, and he said, "Do not make the irrational rational." Right, we want to have conversations about irrational behavior and we want to pontificate about them, but we would be going around in circles, because when you're dealing with irrational thought process, there's nothing in your mind or my mind that will wrap up, because we're not irrational people to that extent to be able to get ourselves into the mindset to understand that. And so it's just like a fruitless conversation at a certain point.
Yeah. I really wonder if the election of the 45th president was an indictment on the hashtag Me Too movement.
I would say not. To this point, even though we're moving off the Me Too, but what it is an indictment is the diminishing role of men having control in our society. It's the diminishing role of men within families, within workplace environment, where they are no longer the top dog and king of the jungle. Right? We have that reality where it's in a sense that I think for a lot of people, whether they may be men or women, there was a change. There's a shift going on when you have a lot more households who are led by women. I think this guy, there's a new study that came out that men are not as eligible to be married now because women have a greater earning potential, and marriage is not being.
Wait. So you mean to tell me you're not as eligible because your potential mate makes more than you? That's absurd.
Listen. That would be another conversation for us to have, right? That's fair.
No, I think I may have found a future commentary.
Yes, I think you may. We will look at that study. But what it's simply saying is that we know historically people stayed married due to financial realities that relegated people to have to stay. That was a great factor for people's marriage being sustained. When you have people who have multiple incomes that are coming into a household, there's options. And with these options, people are making decisions that I don't have to put up with this. I don't have to stay in this relationship. So those are some of the variables that I think that are coming at play, right? So people are wrestling with these nuances of the ever-changing economic, social structure and contracts that existed for decades that are now becoming upheaved with our current reality. You know, so I think those are part of the items that are in play at the same time with the current rhetoric that we're hearing out there and the language being used by our current president.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. The interesting thing is, I try and cover topics on the show that many people don't want to touch. Right?
Sure.
And it's interesting too because the #MeToo movement. This commentary, I've gotten a lot more feedback from women than I have from men on this month's subject. Right, the #MeToo.
Right. I mean, but you can see why you would, right? Because no man wants to get out there and then put his foot in his mouth and feel like, oh my God, I'm going to step over into this line, and then how do I walk myself back? Right? It's a sense of feeling
Unless
uncomfortable.
You're stepping in to say I'm in support.
You could, but then you can.
We need more of.
Yes, I think you could, and I think most men would feel that way, but then the conversation would get a little bit deeper, and then they would have to do some own level of self-examination where they may realize that they have contributed. Right, they haven't necessarily questioned certain ethos or processes which they might have to therefore not feel comfortable in owning within themselves.
So you mean by them they'd have to reckon with the notion of their inaction being action?
Absolutely. Right, we're all flawed. So I might not be the same person I was 5 years ago, 7 years ago, where I'm now becoming enlightened. Right, but I have to reflect back on my past behavior that may have said like, oh, I was definitely contributing to inappropriate behavior or actions that may be deemed offensive or belittling of women, right? So we therefore have to own that. So once men get into this conversation, all of a sudden the mirror may get put up to our face, and that might be hard.
Ooh. Yeah, a level of introspection that might cause a little discomfort. Huh?
Absolutely. Well said.
I often say on this show that the development is in the discomfort, right? The discomfort is where you find the raw material for us to grow and stretch and become better.
Iron sharpens iron, absolutely. But then who picks up the pieces afterwards? Because as men, we are not as forgiving in terms of sharing our emotions, being vulnerable, and then have a place where that vulnerability allows us to pick ourselves up and wrestle with it. Men don't have those type of spaces. Women do a much better job of creating those spaces for one another. But as men, we haven't been educated on the value of those spaces, or we haven't been taught how to formulate and create those spaces for ourselves. So
it's not part of our U.S. culture, right?
You're right. So yeah,
I mean, it's just not part of the culture. Well, look, I don't think that it's going to necessarily go away today or tomorrow. We've seen it at Wynn Resorts, we've seen it at Lululemon, at Barnes & Noble. There are a number of places that have had to deal with kind of #MeToo scandals, and I don't think that we're going to solve it per se on this call. But the one thing I think for us to get closer to solutions and development in this space is that we have to talk about it. We can't pretend that it doesn't exist. And sometimes that does mean take a long, hard, strong look in the mirror, right? As the father of 2 daughters, I certainly find myself having to do it. And so, Dr. David Rudder, I'd like to thank you for joining me on the call today and having this discussion. And we'd love to have you back.
Well, Kevin, I'd like to say thank you. It was great. Anytime I get to have an opportunity to engage in intellectually stimulating conversation on topics that are important to us, I'm grateful for the opportunity. I hope I was able to contribute something. So thank you for the time.
Absolutely.
All right, my friend.
If you join us here each and every week, you'll get a tidbit of information and insight that'll help you be the best version of yourself. Come back next week. Be sure to join us on Facebook within the Facebook group. Check us out on Twitter and on Instagram. Kevin D. Wright. Look us up. Check us out. Link to us online. Love to hear from you. Unlike some of the other podcasts, I want to hear directly from you, and I will answer your question. There's no question too tough, so together we can solve it. Stop back and tell a friend. Leadership is personal. Here's the better results.